It is October 4 and I am at Fort Churchill State Historic Park, and we are going to go walk their paths here and see all the history that there is. Well, first it looks like we're going to go to the Joseph Stewart Trail to the Carson River. Except for the washroom conditions here, they're just outhouses. Otherwise, it's a beautiful park. I love these huge cottonwoods. Well, continuing on with the hike through the Bible, just before the Israelites to enter the Promised Land of Canaan, God spoke to Moses and Eleazar, who is Aaron's son, who is now the high priest. He said, "Take a census of all the congregation of Israel, those who are 20 years old and up, by their fathers' houses, all those who are able to go to war for Israel." You remember that the Israelites had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years because of not trusting God. And you will recall that 40 years earlier, God had a military census taken. That's why it's called the Book of Numbers. Anyway, repeating the military census now was necessary to organize the younger generation and to certify that the older generation was gone, except for Caleb and Joshua. It's interesting to note that this census is only down a couple thousand from the first census, despite the loss of 24,000 people from the plague, which you learned about in my last hike. So in case you're interested, the recorded number was 601,730. Oh, look at this, is so pretty. Carson River. This is a very nice time of year, isn't it? The leaves are just turning. Oh, there's a railway there. This census was also needed for when they conquered the land, for how it would be divided. The larger tribes would get more land, of course. But an interesting scenario came up. A guy by the name of Zelophehad, he was a descendant of Joseph. Well, he had only daughters and no sons, and he died in the wilderness. But the daughters, well, they came to Moses saying, "Why should our father's name be removed from among his family because he has no son? Give us a possession among our father's brothers." Just another view of the river. You see, in patriarchal Israelite society, inheritance was only through the males. And the late Zelophehad, well, he had only daughters. So his name would not be attached to any portion of the Promised Land to keep his memory alive. This would unfairly punish him after his death. Well, Moses, being the wise man that he was, brought this case before the Lord. And God said, "They are right. You shall surely give them a possession among their father's brothers, and cause the inheritance of their father to pass to them." Then he made a statute or precedent for further generations, that if a man dies without sons, his daughters will get an inheritance. It's interesting to note that the Hebrew word "them" is masculine, referring to the prospective offspring. The daughters were considered representative of their own expected sons. If you've learned anything from me, I hope it's that everything recorded in the Old Testament, especially about God's chosen people, but everything really, points to Jesus and his salvation for all mankind. Look at this massive log. So this census God had Moses make before the going into the Promised Land brings to mind how a census will be taken before we, God's end-time people, goes into the Promised Land. In other words, when we go to heaven. In Daniel it is prophesied, "And at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone found written in the book." In Revelation it's called the Book of Life. And in the passage in Revelation that talks about the New Jerusalem, it says, "And the nations of those who are saved shall walk in its light, and the kings of the earth bring glory and honor into it. But there shall by no means enter in anything that defiles or causes an abomination or a lie, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life." Do you see now why God dealt so harshly with the Israelites when they sinned, and why they had to wander in the wilderness before entering into the Promised Land of Canaan? It's all very symbolic, of course, and we could go into heavy study here. But through the blood of the Lamb, which is Jesus, we shall all have our names written in that great census, and we will be able to enter the Promised Land of heaven. Now that's an inheritance that I do not want to miss. Now, this is a rustic area. Their pavilion, kind of an outdoor pavilion. That's neat. I love these benches. And a group area, it looks like. Well, this worked out just great. I was able to get my Bible talk in, and now let's go explore the ancient ruins. Look at this path. Wow, that is some cracked mud. Dry mud. Oh, that was the John C. Fremont picnic area we were just at. So the ruins loop is 0.6 of a mile. They sure built their fort in the middle of nowhere, eh? Established in 1860, Fort Churchill played a key role in the history of this region. During the turbulent decade of the 1860s, troops from the fort helped keep peace between the native Paiute Indians and the ever-encroaching white settlement. They also guarded the Pony Express and telegraph lines, protected California-bound immigrants, settled civil disputes, and performed numerous other duties. By 1869, the reasons for the fort's existence had disappeared, and the post was abandoned. Over the next 88 years, the fort's adobe buildings were left to the effects of Nevada's harsh elements. In 1957, Governor Charles H. Russell, recognizing the fort's historical significance, proclaimed Fort Churchill a Nevada state park. Living quarters for one company of approximately 100 men consisted of 3 buildings, 2 barracks, and a combined mess hall kitchen. By October 1860, 6 barracks were up, but only partially finished, and would remain this way for years. For the enlisted men, life at Fort Churchill was isolated and unpleasant. They lived in dirt-floored barracks, furnished with crude beds and chairs, ate a meager diet of beef, salt pork, bread, and coffee, and performed manual labor for only $13 a month. Recreation was largely limited to fishing on the river or drinking and playing cards at the post store or Buckland's station. Officers and their families lived in 6 1.5-story buildings made of adobe walls 20 inches thick. Wide porches sheltered 3 sides of each building, and attached to the back was a woodshed and privy. No trampling through the weather for these officers. The first floor contained a parlor, 2 bedrooms, a dining room, and a kitchen with a cellar. Life at this post was far more pleasant than other, more isolated outposts, and officers considered Fort Churchill a luxury assignment. This 2-room building served as the administrative headquarters and courtroom for Fort Churchill. Though small, the office would have included everything necessary for the officer in charge to conduct business and communicate beyond the fort. The office served as a stop for the Pony Express and housed a telegraph to help spread news of major events across the country, including President Lincoln's election, the start of the Civil War, and Nevada's statehood. The quartermaster and subsistence storehouses were deliberately situated near the commander's office and within view of the guardhouse to discourage thievery. Both storehouses were built with 20-inch thick adobe walls and included a finished office and a large unfinished storeroom. The U.S. Army stored and distributed food and other equipment from these storehouses to troops at Fort Churchill and across northern Nevada. Army regulations allowed for laundresses. The women who lived in this 4-room structure provided essential back-breaking laundry services for the men at Fort Churchill, who valued spit and polish. The Army provided living quarters and a daily ration for each woman, while the soldiers themselves paid for laundry services. Laundresses were often the wives of enlisted men. When rising construction costs threatened to eliminate the laundresses' quarters at the fort, the soldiers united to prioritize completion of this building. The hospital was distinctly L-shaped and included a kitchen, 3 small rooms, and a cellar. The exact number of patients the hospital could accommodate is unknown. Based on limited records, it seems likely there were 20 or fewer patients at any one time. A staff of 1 post surgeon and 1 matron treated and nursed both soldiers and civilians. The post surgeon was also responsible for sanitation on the post, including garbage disposal and company kitchen inspections. Located in this isolated position on the south side of the grounds, construction of the guardhouse was completed in the spring of 1861. The building's 2 front rooms served as an office and as quarters for the guard on duty, while the cell block contained 4 7-foot by 4-foot cells. During the life of the fort, this building held assorted deserters, drunkards, brawlers, thieves, and other criminals. No known photographs of Fort Churchill from its period of operation exist today. Knowledge of the fort's physical aspects is limited to written descriptions and 1 lithographic drawing. The drawing shown here depicts adobe buildings arranged in a square around the parade ground. Notice the absence of a defensive wall or barrier. Fort Churchill had no exterior wall since it was intended to be a regional base of operations and supply depot rather than a defensive post. From a French word meaning large box, a caisson was a 2-wheeled cart used by field artillery units during the Civil War to transport ammunition. It was attached to another 2-wheeled cart called a limber by a long pole. This 4-wheeled assembly or carriage was pulled by a team of 6 horses. The caisson carried 2 ammunition boxes, a spare limber pole and wheel, and various hand tools. Artillerymen could ride on the ammunition boxes when speed was necessary, but the horses quickly fatigued with the added weight, so the men more commonly marched alongside the carriage. Post Cemetery was the final resting place for soldiers killed in local battles and those who died from exposure, illness, and hardship. In February 1885, more than 15 years after the fort's abandonment, the remains of 44 soldiers were removed and interned at the Lone Mountain Cemetery in Carson City, Nevada. They are listed as Fort Churchill's unknown dead, since weather and time left their headstones unreadable. Only 1 grave could be identified, Charles McDermott, commanding officer at Fort Churchill from 1862 until his death in 1865. Today, the old cemetery holds the remains of Samuel Buckland, local rancher and pioneer. Beside him are the remains of his wife, Eliza Ann, and 5 of their 8 children. Okay, let's see what the visitor center has to show us too. This is some kind of artillery machine. And that's the guy this fort was named after, Sylvester Churchill. And Abraham Lincoln was the president, and James Nye was the governor. And here's a replica of what it might have looked like. And I'm not allowed to go in this room, but this is what the soldiers looked like back then, I guess. All right, I've come full circle. That was kind of fun. If you use your imagination, you can see what a bustling place this was. So thanks for coming along. I hope you enjoyed it. And what is preventing you from giving your life to God so that your name can be written in the book of life and we can meet each other in heaven?